It's now my pleasure to welcome Kobe Jones, our keynote speaker for this evening. Kobe is the Senior Communications Associate at the Digital Impact Alliance and will be speaking about the past, present, and future of the United Nations.
Hi, everyone. As Shane said, my name is Kobe Jones, and I'm the Senior Communications Associate at the Digital Impact Alliance at the United Nations Foundation. I'm honored to take part in this special event, and I wanted to just say a quick thank you to UNA Maine and UNA Bates for bringing us all together virtually today. We're here to honor the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Of course, this is not how we anticipated the world would be celebrating such a milestone, but I am inspired by the way advocates such as yourself have adapted under the limitations of this new normal, finding new ways to connect to one another, to educate, inspire, and mobilize your community to support the UN's work. 2020 has brought unprecedented challenges that are currently impacting every person in the world. We are experiencing a shared urgency, not only to overcome a devastating global pandemic, but to rebuild a stronger foundation for global progress. It is only fitting that we would look to the UN's history and celebrate its fundamental purpose today. The UN represents humanity's highest ideals and most ambitious goals. And yet, it was born from our darkest days. 75 years ago, our world was devastated in the aftermath of World War II. Half the population lived on less than $1 per day. Human life expectancy was only 45 years. Pain and trauma hung like a thick fog, a constant reminder of so many lives lost. Survival meant doing everything in our collective power to ensure humanity would never face this hardship again. From shared experience and suffering, we created a system which would defend us from our worst possible actions. A system to equip future generations with a global network as a first line of defense. As most of you likely know, UNA USA was a fundamental to the UN's inception. In fact, UNA USA members helped to create and visualize the United Nations. 75 years ago, delegates from 50 countries came together to showcase a commitment to international cooperation and shared action for peace. Leading up to this moment, 42 organizations, including the American Association for the United Nations, which is now UNA USA, had advocated for the UN's formation through partnership and persistent lobbying. This rich history with the UN is one of many reasons you work to protect it, defend it, support it, and advocate it for it today. Former First Lady, UNA USA Chairwoman, and human rights trailblazer Eleanor Roosevelt said, "The world of the future is in our making. Tomorrow is now." The UNA USA community has always directed its mission by reconciling with the past, meeting the present moment with a commitment to steer towards hope rather than fear, and creating progress by first deciding what it looks like. Indeed, tomorrow is now. So here we are. It's been 75 years since white laurels on a blue banner became a symbol of peace and hope for all of us. And thanks to the UN's work, we've had some really big wins. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is guiding 193 countries. Nearly half of the world's children have received life-saving vaccines. Smallpox has been eradicated. There's a global agenda to end all forms of discrimination. More than 80 human rights treaties have been signed. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals were unanimously adopted. The Paris Climate Agreement was enacted. And just this past summer, Africa was declared free of wild poliovirus. These are just a few of the UN's global achievements, but to count the everyday impact the UN has on human lives would be impossible. When you examine how much the UN has done for the world in under a century, hope is tangible and real. But right now, in 2020, we find ourselves against a similar backdrop as the one in 1945, when finding hope after World War II seemed impossible. Right now, major challenges of unprecedented scale are clouding our forward vision. The COVID-19 pandemic has stopped the world in its tracks, changing our lives overnight. This virus has taken over 1 million lives, devastated global and national economies, exacerbated existing racial and gender inequalities, and taken a record number of children out of school and families into poverty. It's become very clear that COVID-19 is not only a global health crisis, it's a social crisis, it's an economic crisis, and it's a human rights crisis. And of course, COVID-19 is not the only danger to our global community. Police brutality, discriminatory violence, and systemic racism against people of color, particularly Black Americans, are impossible to ignore. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Jacob Blake, Daniel Prude. Just a few names in an endless list of lives stolen or harmed forever at the hands of police violence. Americans have taken to the streets to ask how and when the injustice will end, because the suffering of Black Americans have endured for more than 400 years and is too much to bear. We also fear the effects of climate change, which have become more frequent and severe. Deadly hurricanes, uncontrollable wildfires, record-shattering heat waves, rising sea levels. The threats are real and increasing. No longer is climate change a future problem. It's a problem now, and the future depends on our actions. In the face of these major challenges, our administration has backed away from the global stage, making the choice to retreat from shared progress rather than lead, as America has always done. In recent years, we've stepped back from the Paris Climate Agreement, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and the UN Human Rights Council. We've cut funding vital to the UN's work, ending contributions to the UN Population Fund, aid to the Palestinian refugees, counterterrorism efforts, UN peacekeeping missions, and the Green Climate Funds. The US is estimated to owe the UN more than $1 billion in unpaid dues. And most recently, in a dangerous, short-sighted decision, our nation moved to terminate our relationship with the World Health Organization in the middle of a global pandemic. It's hard to imagine where we would be without the WHO leading the global response to COVID-19. From managing accelerated vaccine development, to tracking virus transmission, to ensuring equitable patient care in developing countries, to delivering life-saving PPE to governments who need it, including our own, WHO is doing a job that no one nation could do alone. It's easy to feel discouraged by the magnitude of the global challenges we face and the administration's actions to remove America from multilateral agreements. Many believe that America's hard-won leadership on the global stage is being undermined. But there is a silver lining. The UN was built for moments like this. In our darkest hours, the UN system is still working to end the COVID-19 pandemic, to hold all nations accountable to protecting and advancing universal human rights, to combat climate change, to protect innocent people displaced by violence, and so much more. This 75-year-old mechanism for global teamwork is serving the purpose we built it for. As UNA USA advocates well know, even a system built with the best intentions needs persistent voices behind it. When President Trump announced the US would withdraw from the WHO, UNA USA members and advocates like you took swift action, sending more than 10,000 letters urging Congress to oppose the decision, educating your communities about WHO's crucial impact, and raising money for the COVID-19 response to support the WHO. And this certainly isn't the only time in recent months that UNA USA members have tuned the UN's guiding principles into local action. Recently, all Americans and of all ages and races have been raising their voices to leaders at every level, from our city councils to the White House, to demand justice and declare that Black Lives Matter. Our nation has not lived up to the ideals set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document which the US helped write. Human rights are not guaranteed for Black people in America. In many cases, those rights are actively overlooked and denied. Blatant, unforgivable human rights violations in the form of racial discrimination, oppression, and violence continue to plague our nation, and we are calling for justice. Thousands of you have shown up for this effort, educating yourselves in your communities, engaging in civil action, and sending thousands of letters to your members of Congress to support initiatives for lasting change. This year, your human rights advocacy didn't stop with letters to Congress. Hundreds of USA members and advocates showed up to participate in an important UN process to hold the US accountable for protecting human rights. In November, the United States will undergo a universal periodic review of its domestic human rights record at the UN Human Rights Council. In preparation for the review, USA campuses and community member chapters hosted local consultations to provide recommendations for how the US can do better. You submitted 11 reports to the UN Human Rights Council, which examined issues like gun violence, criminal justice reform, election integrity, gender discrimination, and immigrant rights at the community level. These are only some of the ways USA members are supporting the UN's goals and carrying out its work here on our own soil, even when our federal leadership is falling short. Whether it's donating masks to healthcare workers, raising money for local food banks, hosting community discussions to empower women and girls, petitioning local governments to help combat climate change, engaging in peaceful protests against police violence, volunteering to help survivors of human trafficking, or anything else in the long list of actions for global progress that USA members take, every day you bring our world one step closer to achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and ensuring a bright, prosperous future for all people. So now we've revisited the past, the devastating reality that led to the UN's creation, and the milestones our world has reached in the 75 years since. We've discussed the present, the urgent challenges we are facing, and some of the ways UN and global advocates like you are stepping up to meet the moment. Now, instead of visualizing the future, a world that feels distant, I want you to think about our role in defining progress so that we know not only what it looks like, but what will it take to push it forward? How do we create and implement a vision for progress? Earlier this year, in preparation for the UN 75th celebration, Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the world's largest conversation on creating the future we want. USA took on the responsibility of bringing American perspectives to the table, holding virtual consultations with citizens from all 50 US states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico to join the world in formulating a productive vision for the future. Combining feedback from more than 80 consultations, USA learned that 77% of Americans expect a worse world based on current trends. At first glance, this figure is discouraging, but all we have to do is look back onto the past and recognize a familiar pattern. Collective concern for our future is exactly what propelled the creation of the UN back in 1945. The truth is, if many current trends in our nation and our world continue, the world will likely worsen in many ways. At the same time, progressive actions born from shared urgency are strengthening our global efforts for change. We are experiencing a moment where destructive global trends are accelerating movements that carve out space for progress. People from across our country and our world are standing up to end racism. We see more voices in the Black Lives Matter movement and more people exchanging their words for meaningful action in the fight for racial justice. From our efforts to physically distance from one another during the COVID-19 outbreak, we've formed new ways of connecting with technology, which are bound to stick with us and expand the boundaries of our communities far into the future. We see more Americans, companies, organizations, and governments taking action to combat climate change. We see young people leading the conversation as they activate for progress, demanding their futures be protected. And although there's no way to paint a positive picture for millions of Americans whose income or education has been affected by the current state of the world, We can only continue to advocate for a more inclusive, sustainable job economy and more accessible and inclusive education options for everyone, everywhere. Despite sentiments of concern among participants in your consultations, the major outcomes from these discussions were action-based solutions. The input from UNA USA's consultation process is helping the UN to build a better world right now. Americans identified that individuals, governments, organizations, and the United Nations all have a critical role to play in building the future we want. Progress must be defined with the future in mind. We press for change now so that future generations have a foundation to build on. When we eventually recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, the world won't look the same as it did before. It's our task now to make sure it looks better. As we near the end of 2020, we pledge to embark on a decade of action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in time for their 2030 deadline. The only direction to go is one that points towards progress. Now, I'd like you to take a moment and reflect on what progress looks like to you. What would true progress mean in your community? What would you like to see? We all have a stake in our future, so I implore you to connect with a goal of your own, to continue building this momentum towards 2030. Reflect on what more you can do or continue to do to be a champion for the SDGs in your community. Lean into this network of people to provide you both support and accountability, because continuing the dialogue and engaging with others is key for success. The UN's mission, declared in the UN Charter, reads, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Right now, as we honor 75 years since these words changed the world, they feel more relevant than ever. Progress will be realized when Black Americans feel safe and respected in their own country, when we have saved succeeding generations from the effects of climate change, when human rights are guaranteed to every person, no matter where they live, how they worship, what they look like, or who they love. And when we can reestablish our nation's leadership on the world stage, working alongside fellow member states to prepare coordinated responses to our future health crises. These are just a few of the many ways we define progress in this moment. In another 25 years, when the UN turns 100, we will surely need new, evolved definitions of progress, but the foundation will be stronger. And the UN will support humankind's never-ending pursuit for a better world. Thank you. Now, just to conclude, I'd like to invite you to take part in an advocacy action right now. As the global community commemorates 75 years since the UN's establishment, the UN remains the only organization capable of bringing 103 countries together under one roof to address an array of issues critical to all of us. This is why we need you to take action now. As I mentioned earlier, the US is estimated to owe the UN more than $1 billion in unpaid dues. This has serious implications for the UN's work. When we pay our dues on time and in full, we are stronger, safer, and more prosperous as we work together in the world. I think we can all agree now is not the time to step back from global progress and forfeit our seat at the table. So I want everyone to take out their phone and text UN75 to 30644 to urge your member of Congress to support full US funding for the United Nations. So you just open your phone and you create a new message like this. And then in the to section, you type 30644, like this, right here, 30644. And then in the body of the message, you text UN75, like that. And then you press send, and a message will be sent to our members of Congress. So thank you very much for your time today.